Welcome, dear subscribers and curious listeners of my channel. Fred and George Weasley are undeniably among the most mischievous and vibrant characters in the entire Harry Potter universe. Their jokes could lighten even the darkest years. But sometimes the twins cross that line where fun turns into risk and a prank becomes trouble. Today, let's look at the moments when the Weasleys went a bit too far. Enjoy watching. Number 1, Ron is arachnophobia. Ron is one of the bravest heroes in the story, but everyone knows his terror of spiders. Few, however, remember where this fear began. When Ron was just 3 years old, Fred and George decided to get revenge for a broken broom by turning his beloved teddy bear into a giant spider. For the older boys, it was just a prank, but for little Ron, it was a nightmare, one that followed him for the rest of his life. Number 2, Montague and the Vanishing Cabinet, one of the darkest tricks the twins ever pulled. By locking Montague inside the Vanishing Cabinet, Fred and George had no idea they were sending him into a trap between two locations. The poor boys spent hours drifting between Hogwarts and Nocturne Alley before attempting a dangerous disapparition just to escape, the scariest part. The twins later told this story with uncanny calmness, as if nothing serious had happened. Number 3, testing products on first years. When their dream of opening a shop was just beginning, the twins needed to test their inventions. And who did they choose? Of course, first-year students, the easiest targets. Young students ended up in the hospital wing after these big tests. Hermione was furious, but Fred and George simply brushed her off. These experiments were openly risky, far from cute little pranks. Number 4, Ron and the Unbreakable Vow. A magically binding oath where breaking it means death, not something to play with. But the twins, wanting to stage a prank, almost forced 5-year-old Ron into making an unbreakable vow. Only Arthur Weasley's timely intervention prevented a disaster. Ron later recalled it was the only moment when he saw his father as angry as his mother. Number 5, Professor Quirrell and the Enchanted Snowballs. Perhaps one of the strangest and most questionable antics. During winter, the twins enchanted snowballs so they would chase Professor Quirrell and hit him right on the turban, the very spot where Voldemort was hidden. Yes, we know who Quirrell really was, but at the time he appeared to be nothing more than a nervous, stuttering teacher. The prank was harsh, to say the least. Number 6, Percy and the Pyramid Trap. During a family trip to Egypt, Fred and George tried to lock Percy inside a pyramid, just for a laugh. But ancient magical structures are no place for jokes. If their prank had worked, the consequences could have been far worse than another family argument. Number 7, The Joke Shop, Dangerous Fun. Opening Weasley's Wizard Wheezes was a dream come true, but the shop itself was in many ways a joke taken a bit too far. Some products were outright dangerous love potions capable of forcing someone to fall in love against their will. Ron was the first victim, Peruvian instant darkness powder, later used by Draco to let Death Eaters into Hogwarts, other harmless items that could become weapons in the wrong hands. Fun is fun, but responsibility still matters. Number 8, Extendable Ears and Breached Privacy. Fred and George were never able to resist a secret. Their prototype, extendable ears, slithered under doors and around corners like pale strings of living yarn, carrying every whisper straight to the boys' room. "We are just gathering intelligence," George joked, as they pressed their heads together to listen. One evening at the Burrow, they aimed the newest version toward the kitchen, where Arthur and Molly were holding a private discussion. The boys expected talk about bills or chores. Instead, Arthur's tense voice drifted through the ear. "Voldemort is moving. The Order must act quickly." The air froze. Fred swallowed. George whispered, "This is big. Too big." They didn't keep the information to themselves. Ginny walked in moments later, and the twins, still buzzing from the shock, told her everything. Her face went white. "Why would you say that to me?" she cried. "Why would you even listen to that?" She backed away, trembling at the mention of Voldemort's name. The twins stared at her, guilt creeping in. They had crossed into their parents' private world without thinking, dragging their sister into fears she wasn't meant to carry. That night, the extendable ears lay tangled on the desk, limp and forgotten. A reminder that some secrets aren't meant to be stolen, and curiosity can wound more deeply than any prank. Number 9, Magical Fireworks and Chaos in Hogwarts. Fred and George's rebellion during their 5th year was legendary. The moment their enchanted fireworks erupted through the corridor, students cheered as Catherine Wheels chased Dolores Umbridge down the stairs and a giant fire dragon roared across the ceiling. "Best moment of my life," Lee Jordan shouted as the sparks rained gold. But the chaos didn't stay funny for long. A stray rocket burst near a group of Ravenclaws, leaving Anthony Goldstein with a burned sleeve and a painful scorch on his arm. A swarm of pink exploding butterflies crashed into a tapestry, setting it smouldering before Filch stamped it out with frantic kicks. Even Dumbledore had to intervene when a fire serpent slithered through the library and wrapped itself around a bookcase, threatening to ignite the shelves. He extinguished it with a single sweep of his wand, then sighed. Spectacle has its price. The twins never meant to hurt anyone, but the wreckage told another story. Broken vases, burned curtains, students coughing through clouds of coloured smoke. What began as justice against Umbridge turned into a reminder that even the most dazzling magic can spiral into danger when unleashed without restraint. Number 10. The fake fortune teller prank on Neville. Fred and George were certain their new invention, the future forecaster, would be the hit of the common room. It resembled a tiny brass box engraved with runes, and when tapped, it spat out a strip of parchment predicting the user his destiny. "It's foolproof," Fred bragged. "And terrifyingly accurate," George added with a grin. In reality, the device was loaded with pre-written predictions, each crafted to shock, embarrass, or send someone into a panic. The twins treated it like a joke. They never imagined anyone would take the messages to heart. Neville Longbottom did. He approached the gadget with shy curiosity, asking, "Do you think it'll say something good? Maybe something about herbology?" Fred winked and said, "Only one way to find out." Neville tapped the box. It rattled. A parchment slid out, trembling like a warning. He unfolded it slowly. The message was short and cruel. "You will lose everything you love." Neville went still, his face drained of colour. No, that can't be right," he whispered, holding the paper as if it were cursed. He stumbled out of the room before anyone could speak. For the next few days, Neville lived in a quiet panic. He checked on Trevor every hour. He wrote a long, anxious letter to his grandmother. In class, he barely lifted his wand. Even Professor Sprout noticed and murmured, "You seem troubled, dear." Meanwhile, the twins watched him from across the great hall, their laughter long gone. George finally muttered, "We've really messed this one up." The joke had shattered something fragile in Neville, and the realization hit them hard. Fear isn't funny when it stops being a game. Number 11, Hermione's magically dyed hair. Hermione Granger had never been afraid to confront Fred and George, especially when their pranks crossed a line. One afternoon in the Gryffindor common room, she scolded them sharply for testing experimental products on first years. "You could have seriously hurt someone," she said, arms crossed, eyes blazing. The twins exchanged a look. Fred whispered, "She's asking for it." George nodded, and that was the moment they decided on payback. During potions the next day, they slipped a vial of enchanted dye into Hermione's cauldron. It dissolved instantly, leaving no trace. When she leaned over to check the mixture, a soft pop echoed, and her hair flashed a blinding neon green. The color spread like wildfire, glowing brighter with every passing second. Hermione gasped, touching her curls. What did you do to me?" She tried a counterspell. Nothing. Another attempt. Still nothing. The classroom burst into laughter and someone shouted, "Ah, look out, it's the Emerald Witch!" Hermione fled the room, cheeks burning. Her reflection in the corridor window nearly made her cry. The green refused to fade, as if mocking her with every strand. Even the usually unshakable Professor McGonagall paused and said softly, "Miss Granger?" "Oh my." When Harry caught up to her, she whispered, "Everyone is staring." The hours crawled by until the dye finally wore off, leaving her exhausted and furious. It wasn't just a joke. She felt targeted, embarrassed, betrayed. Ron's reaction surprised everyone. He stormed into the common room where the twins were celebrating their masterpiece. "Oh, that wasn't funny," he snapped. "She's your friend. Apologize, Fred." His grin faltered. George looked away. For the first time that week, they realized they had gone too far, far beyond harmless mischief. They muttered an apology, but Hermione didn't answer right away. The silence said enough. Even pranksters like Fred and George had to learn that not every laugh was worth the cost. Number 12, Lee Jordan's trapped briefcase. Lee Jordan had always been the one person who understood Fred and George better than anyone else. He laughed at their pranks, helped test their inventions, and even defended them when teachers complained. That was why the twins felt bold enough to play a trick on him. They swapped his school bag with a magical replica designed to burst open in a cloud of violent sneezing slime the moment it was unbuckled. "He'll love it," George whispered. "It?" Yes, practically a compliment, but the prank went wrong before it even began. During potions class, Professor Snape reached for what he thought was Lee's ordinary bag. He lifted the flap with his usual cold precision. There was a hiss, a wobble, and then boom. A fountain of thick green slime sprayed across the room, coating tables, cauldrons, and every startled student in sight. Someone yelled, "It's in my eyes," while Snape stood motionless, dripping, his expression darker than a storm cloud. His voice cut through the chaos. "Evacuate! Now!" And the entire class bolted out the door. Lee didn't even understand what had happened until Snape summoned him later. "Mr. Jordan," Snape said with a terrifying calm, "your belongings caused a hazardous disruption. You will serve 1 week of detention." Lee tried to protest. "Sir, that wasn't my bag. I swear I didn't touch anything." But Snape only narrowed his eyes and replied, "Excuses do not interest me." The door shut behind Lee, leaving him stunned and furious. He hadn't even opened the cursed thing, yet he was the one punished. Fred and George found him later in the common room, still picking slime from his hair. They shuffled their feet and murmured, "Lee, look, mate, we're sorry. We didn't think Snape would—" Lee cut them off. "Yeah, you never think." His words hit harder than any spell. Even Fred fell silent. For the first time, the twins realized that a joke could wound a friend more deeply than an enemy, and by the time they apologized, the damage had already been done. Number 13, nose-biting teacups and their misuse. Fred and George's next masterpiece of mischief came in the form of a quill. Not an ordinary one, of course. This one wrote on its own, scratching across parchment without a single touch. The twins boasted that it was a guaranteed exam saver, and George even waved it proudly, saying, "It practically thinks for you." What they didn't mention was the quill. As fatal flaw, it produced complete nonsense. Grammar collapsed. Facts twisted themselves inside out. It once wrote, "The Goblin Rebellion of 1612 was led by a very angry turnip, and neither twin bothered to fix it." Colin Creevey was their chosen victim. Nervous, earnest, and desperate to do well, he accepted the enchanted quill with wide eyes. "Are you sure it'll help?" he asked, clutching it like a lifeline. Fred grinned. "It'll write everything you need." During the exam, the quill took off like a mad creature. Colin tried to stop it. He whispered, "Please, slow down," but the quill only scribbled faster. When Professor McGonagall collected the papers, she raised a sharp eyebrow at the stream of gibberish, including the memorable line, "Cats are small lions that pretend to be chairs." The aftermath was brutal. McGonagall summoned Colin to her office with a voice so cold that even Lee Jordan muttered, "They've gone too far this time." Colin burst into tears before she even closed the door behind him. He kept repeating, "I didn't write any of it, Professor," but the damage was done. His test was marked a failing grade, the red ink circling whole paragraphs of nonsense. When he emerged, pale and shaking, he avoided everyone. His eyes. Fred and George snickered in the hallway, but their laughter rang hollow. Even Lee refused to join in. "Not cool," he said quietly before walking away. For once, the twins had no clever comeback. The sight of Colin wiping his face with trembling hands lingered longer than any joke. Their magical quill had proved one thing with painful clarity. Not every invention is worth showing off, especially when someone else pays the price. Number 14. Turning Ginny's hamster into a light show. Ginny Weasley adored animals, and her little hamster Nibbles was her pride. The tiny creature spent most days curled in her palms, squeaking softly whenever she whispered, "Don't worry, Nibbles, I'll protect you." That was why the disaster struck so painfully. One afternoon, Fred and George decided to improve the hamster with a bit of magic. A single flick of Fred's wand, and suddenly Nibbles glowed bright gold, scampered across the ceiling, and squealed out something that sounded suspiciously like "Forward March," the opening of a goblin anthem. At first, the twins laughed. George even shouted, "Look at him go! He's a natural performer." But the fun didn't last. The terrified hamster darted from wall to wall, leaving streaks of light behind him. Ginny screamed for them to stop. Nibbles jumped from the ceiling, bolted across the room, and vanished straight into the fireplace. A puff of ash rose, and he was gone. Ginny dropped to her knees, trembling. She kept repeating, "He didn't even know what was happening." For the next week, the burrow turned painfully silent wherever Ginny walked. She cried so much that even Ron avoided joking. At dinner one night, she whispered, He trusted me and Molly's face tightened with fury. The twins hid in the attic, convinced this was the end of their freedom. They remembered how Molly shouted, "If you ever cast a spell without thinking again, so help me, you'll be living in the chicken coop." The incident became one of those family stories no one wanted to retell. It revealed something the Weasley children rarely admitted. Even the funniest magic could wound someone deeply. Fred and George understood that too late. Ginny learned the hard way that love for a small creature can hurt more fiercely than any curse. Number 15, Slime in the Slytherin Goblet. The evening had begun with a rare, almost unsettling harmony at Hogwarts, the sort of atmosphere that happens only when professors force it into existence. The Great Hall had been transformed into a tapestry of inter-house unity. Banners of red, green, blue and yellow draped side by side, candles floated low for soft warmth, and the tables were rearranged so students of different houses would sit together. Even the enchanted ceiling seemed quieter. It was the kind of celebration that made Professor Dumbledore beam. With that kind of painfully hopeful smile, the Weasley twins found irresistible as a target. Fred and George observed the preparations with the intense focus of professional mischief crafters. While Professor Flitwick charmed garlands and Professor Sprout directed floating potted flowers, the twins whispered plans that would add a touch of spice, as George put it. The idea took shape when their eyes fell upon the Cup of Slytherin, a massive silver trophy traditionally displayed only during Quidditch victories, now repurposed as a ceremonial punch container. It gleamed under the candlelight, elevated as if begging for attention. Fred later told Lee Jordan that the cup practically flirted with them, urging them to do something memorable. Their enchantment was subtle, elegant, almost artistic in its mischief. A spoon dipped into the punch would reveal nothing unusual, a cup poured normally. But the moment someone lifted the large trophy itself, an action everyone knew, Slytherins loved for dramatic flair, the liquid inside would react, thicken, transform into a viscous emerald slime. The twins were particularly proud of the colour. To them, it felt like poetic justice. They even joked that the result resembled the ambition of Slytherin House, sticky and impossible to remove. Not even Hermione noticed the faint glimmer on the cup's rim, though she later claimed she had been far too busy making sure Neville didn't accidentally charm the tablecloth into flames. As the celebration unfolded, laughter echoed between the tables. Even students who normally avoided each other nodded politely across the plates of pudding. Harry noticed that the energy of the room felt different from the usual tension-riddled feasts. Ron, who was more focused on treacle tart, admitted it was the calmest Slytherins have looked all year. Draco Malfoy sat near several Ravenclaws, pretending not to be impressed by Luna Lovegood's description of cloud-breeding, crumple-horned Snorkax. For a moment it seemed as if the professor's dream of unity was actually working. But every harmony at Hogwarts has a limit, and this one arrived when Millicent Bulstrode strode confidently toward the Cup of Slytherin. Known for her formidable stance, broad shoulders, and a stare that could intimidate even seventh-year boys, she had an unwavering loyalty to her house. She lifted the heavy trophy with the ceremonial pride of a knight raising her shield. In that single second before the enchantment activated, George nudged Fred, and both privately cherished the wicked anticipation. Harry later recalled in a letter that he had seen the unmistakable sparkle in Fred. his eyes that meant something catastrophic was about to happen. The transformation was instantaneous. The punch inside the trophy swirled once, bubbled twice, and erupted into a cascade of dense green slime. It poured over Bulstrode's robe, oozed down her sleeves, and clung to her hair in thick ropes. The texture was so sticky that even gravity seemed confused about what to do with it. A gasp ran across the hall, followed by a horrified squeak from a nearby Hufflepuff. The slime dripped onto the floor with a sound reminiscent of a sluggish monster breathing. If the twins had hoped for a dramatic visual, they achieved it with near-artistic brilliance. Millicent stood frozen at first, stunned into silence. Then came the eruption. Her roar of indignation shook the table. The students backing away from her later insisted they saw her eyes flare, just as described in Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, when Harry had wrestled her in the dueling club and her expression had been fierce, like a bull about to charge. This time she lived up to that comparison. She swung the trophy wildly, spraying more slime onto several innocent bystanders, including a horrified Cho Chang and a stunned Anthony Goldstein, who later complained the substance took 3 days to fully wash out of his eyebrows. The sudden chaos spread quickly. Marcus Flint leapt from his seat, demanding justice. Pansy Parkinson shrieked about her robe being worth more than all of Gryffindor Tower. A few Gryffindors couldn't hold back laughter, and it acted like fire to dry tinder. Slytherins interpreted every giggle as mockery. Plates clattered, chairs scraped, and before long the inter-house unity dissolved into a storm of accusations and insults. A stray cupcake flew across the hall, splattering against a Ravenclaw banner. Even Hermione shouted over the noise, attempting and failing to restore order. At the far end of the staff table, Professor Snape rose with such a slow, controlled movement that several students immediately fell silent. His face was expressionless, but the dangerous stillness around him was unmistakable. Harry remembered another line from the books. Snape looked as though someone had insulted him personally. That was exactly the expression he wore now. His gaze moved across the hall until it landed squarely on the Weasley twins, who were doing an atrocious job pretending to examine the ceiling. Snape, his tone was low, icy, and every syllable seemed to vibrate with suppressed fury. Students claimed he whispered something about reckless disregard for school dignity, deliberate humiliation of Slytherin House, and detentions so severe they would make Filch weep with joy. Fred later admitted to Ginny that he had never felt so close to being transformed into a garden shrub for the rest of his natural life. George claimed Snape's expression alone could have curdled a cauldron of amortentia. Number 16. Fake fan letters to Harry. Fred and George Weasley had always carried an aura of cheerful chaos around them, a whirlwind of enchanted fireworks, self-inflating cushions, and laughter that echoed through the corridors of Hogwarts. But the moment the Triwizard Tournament thrust Harry Potter into an unwelcome spotlight, his name pulled from the Goblet of Fire against his will, the twins sensed a new arena for mischief. They watched, amused, as Hogwarts whispered about Harry's unexpected fame, and soon they found themselves plotting a stunt that in their minds would be harmless fun but would quickly overflow the boundaries of ordinary school pranks. The idea came from a passing comment by Lee Jordan about how Arch champions always receive fan mail. Fred seized on the notion instantly. George expanded it. Instead of waiting for real admirers to send letters to Harry, they would create one, only theirs would be far more dramatic, sentimental, and utterly mortifying. They chose a fictional admirer whose identity was meant to ignite Harry's embarrassment, a mysterious girl named Celestine Bloom, allegedly a Ravenclaw 6th year, enchanted by Harry, his bravery in facing dragons, mermaids, and mazes. They imagined a kind of overly poetic devotion that even Lockhart would have blushed to read. The first letter they created was dipped in a perfume that smelled unmistakably like the sugary rosewater scent, Fleur Delacour, used around the Yule Ball. The scent was so overpowering that even Hermione later joked that it could knock over a troll. Fred crafted lines such as, "Your emerald eyes blaze brighter than the Hungarian horntail's fire," adding flourishes of admiration for Harry's courage underwater. George added a small photograph from an old Daily Prophet clipping. Harry mid-flight on his firebolt during 3rd year, placing just enough charm on the image to make it wink. When they sealed the envelope with a heart-shaped sparkle charm, they were thoroughly convinced of their comedic genius. The letter found Harry early one morning in the Gryffindor common room, where he sat half asleep over a bowl of porridge. The scent hit him first, swirling through the air like a cloud that refused to dissipate. He opened the envelope cautiously, and his face gradually shifted from confusion to disbelief, then to full-blown mortification. The words were far too personal, far too intimate, and for a boy still aching from the emotional toll of the tournament, the experience felt unsettling rather than funny. Harry later remembered a phrase that kept circling in his mind from "the goblet of fire." He would have given almost anything not to be facing the looks of everyone watching him. The letter brought that feeling right back. What Harry didn't know was that Fred and George had not stopped at one letter. They had written 3 more, each more elaborate and invasive than the last. The second included a lock of supposedly silver-blonde hair, enchanted to shimmer in the candlelight. The third came with a miniature bottle of perfume labelled "Enchanted Devotion," a potion-like fragrance that flashed pink sparks when opened. The fourth featured a magically animated photo of Celestine Bloom herself, a face assembled by combining features of several Hogwarts girls, making her eerily flawless in a way that unsettled even the twins when they tested it. By the time the second letter arrived, the dormitory had caught wind of the joke. Dean Thomas was the first to find it, and in a burst of curiosity he opened it before Harry even saw the envelope. In the privacy of the Gryffindor boys' dormitory, the letters began circulating like forbidden contraband. Seamus Finnegan held dramatic reenactments of Celestine's alleged devotion. Neville Longbottom blushed and tried his best to ignore the commotion. Each reading grew louder, more theatrical, and by the third letter, half the dorm was quoting lines aloud from memory, fueling Harry's growing frustration. Harry's embarrassment deepened into genuine distress when the fourth letter was read aloud in the Gryffindor common room. Several younger students gathered near the fireplace, giggling as someone theatrically recited, "I treasure every glimpse of you, Harry, even from afar, as though fate itself draws our paths together." The animated photo blinked coyly, adding to the humiliation. Harry had often wished for anonymity, a desire echoed in the line from the book he once clung to internally. "Fame is a fickle friend, Harry." At that moment, the truth of the phrase stung sharper than any curse. Ron Weasley, typically the first to laugh at any of his brother's jokes, felt something shift. Watching Harry, shoulders tense and his cheeks flush crimson, wasn't the harmless amusement he expected. Ron's loyalty pulled at him. He knew Harry had endured enough during the tournament: dragons that scorched the arena, cold waters filled with merfolk who tugged at his limbs, mazes that whispered dark temptations. This was a boy who, as Dumbledore once said, had shown bravery beyond measure. Seeing him mocked for a vulnerability he didn't ask for made Ron uneasy. Hermione Granger's reaction was even stronger. She recognized humiliation instantly, and her expression hardened the moment she caught wind of the prank. She had spent the entire year defending Harry from rumors and suspicion, repeating again and again that he did not put his name in the goblet. When she realized the letters were fake, her tone toward Fred and George sharpened. She reminded them that Harry had already survived a dragon and the suffocating weight of being mistrusted by their classmates. To mock him now, she felt, was cruelty disguised as humor. Number 17, Truth Serum Incident with Professor Flitwick. Fred and George Weasley had built their reputation at Hogwarts on the delicate line between mischief and genius, and most professors tolerated their inventions with a mixture of resignation and reluctant admiration. Yet during Harry's 5th year, the twins allowed their talent to drift into territory even they did not fully anticipate. Rumors later claimed that it began with a single offhand remark that Professor Cuthbert Binns, the ghostly lecturer of history of magic, might actually be interesting if he were coaxed into telling something that hadn't been fossilized by centuries of monotone retelling. Fred allegedly said he had brewed a variant of Veritaserum he called a nudge of honesty, while George insisted it was a harmless experiment meant to liven up the old classroom fog. Their goal, according to several Gryffindors, was nothing more sinister than to make the spectral professor reveal why he still wandered the castle instead of passing to the next world. The irony, almost legendary now among students, was that Professor Binns could not be affected by potions at all. Harry later remarked that even when a student spilled hot tea through the professor's chest, Binns only drifted aside with the same indifferent composure. Thus, when the twins slipped a small vial labelled mild persuasion into the pocket of George's robes, they did not fully realize how the lack of a corporeal target might complicate the plan. They timed the prank during the shuffle of quills and books at the start of class. George drifted near the lectern, pretending to look for parchment. Fred nudged him, signaling the moment, but as George uncorked the vial, a sudden gust from an open window swept the potion from his hand. The silvery liquid arced in the air like a thread of molten glass, missing Binns entirely and disappearing among the stacks of cups left from the previous gathering of the Charms Club. It was hours before anyone discovered that the potion had not evaporated, but settled neatly into the wrong cup. Professor Phileas Flitwick, second favourite chipped blue mug, the one he often left on the side table near classroom materials. Flitwick, known for his cheerful disposition, had spent the morning rehearsing a demonstration of advanced summoning charms for his third-year students. He was entirely unaware that the mug he retrieved during a short pause between classes now contained a diluted but still potent dose of truth-inducing brew. When he sipped from it, he felt only the familiar warmth of his spiced tea, but the potion seeped into his thoughts, loosening the boundaries between what he meant to say and what he would never consciously reveal. Students later recalled how the lecture began normally, with Flitwick floating several books above his head in a graceful spiral. But halfway through a sentence, he paused, blinked, and admitted in a trembling voice that he feared mice more than any other creature, even more than Cornish pixies. Several Ravenclaws exchanged wide-eyed glances, puzzled by the sudden confession. Flitwick, seemingly unaware of the strangeness of his admission, continued his lesson, but within minutes he drifted into memories he had guarded for decades. He spoke of a colleague he had admired deeply during his early years at Hogwarts, a witch whose kindness resonated through small gestures like repairing a student, broken quill, or leaving sweets in the staff room during exam season. Her name, he revealed with uncharacteristic candor, was Professor Helene Quarrelby, a long-retired charms theorist. The class sat frozen as Flitwick described how he had once written her a note confessing his affection, but never delivered it out of fear of disrupting their professional relationship. He murmured that he kept the note folded between the pages of a dusty charms compendium in his office. Harry, seated near the front, remembered that moment with painful clarity years later. Flitwick's voice carried a quiet vulnerability that felt at odds with his usual buoyant confidence. It was then the students began realizing something was profoundly wrong. They recalled hearing warnings in potions class: truth serums can strip away a wizard as emotional armor. They understood this was not the eccentric reminiscing of an aging professor, but the involuntary unspooling of private thoughts no one should be forced to share. Stories circulated afterward about how the students tried to keep the atmosphere gentle out of respect for their beloved teacher, yet nothing could mask the way Flitwick, as sentences grew heavier, echoing through the silent classroom. He began revealing small insecurities, like the frustration he felt whenever he needed a stool to reach high shelves, or the embarrassment of having once fallen into a suit of armor during his first year on the staff. He even quoted from a letter he had written to himself during a particularly discouraging period: "It is not the stature of the wizard that defines his magic, but the steadiness of his heart." These words would later be repeated in common rooms with a mixture of affection and sorrow. Perhaps the most painful detail of the incident, as reported by a Hufflepuff student, was the moment Flitwick abruptly stopped mid-sentence, placing a hand on his chest as if something inside him tugged sharply. His eyes widened, and for a brief second it seemed he realized he was saying things he never intended to speak aloud. The potion, however, pushed past his resistance, making him admit that he often doubted whether students saw him as more than the small professor with a squeaky voice. The confession struck the room like a cold wind. Several students instinctively leaned forward as though willing him silently to stop before the potion peeled another layer of his soul. Number 18, Gnome Snot Chews and Public Embarrassment. Fred and George Weasley were known for pushing the boundaries of humour, but there existed a moment at Hogwarts when their latest invention crossed an invisible line, leaving even the teachers divided between admiration and horror. Their creation, mischievously titled Chewable Gnome Snot, was among the earliest prototypes of what would later evolve into the famed products of Weasley's Wizard Wheezes. The candies looked deceptively harmless, small, bright green droplets with a faint shimmer, but the effects were anything but subtle. Anyone reckless enough to bite into one would not only experience streams of vivid, sticky green mucus pouring from their nose, but each inhalation triggered a shrill, piercing squeal that could be heard across several corridors. The Weasley twins tested the sweets for weeks in the Gryffindor common room, scribbling notes into a battered notebook where Fred had once copied down a line from Hogwarts, a history. Magic must always be approached with caution. George had jokingly underlined it 3 times, but even he admitted later that chewable gnome snot deserved its own chapter on magical misjudgments. Their mischievous curiosity pushed them to refine the formula, making the squeak louder and the green mucus thicker. By the time the candies were ready for their first true test, the twins could barely hide their excitement, convinced they had crafted what Fred privately labelled a masterpiece of controlled chaos. The opportunity to unleash their creation presented itself in the form of a Hufflepuff second year named Oliver Cresswell, a quiet, bookish boy with a nervous habit of adjusting his spectacles. Oliver had been selected to give a short, inspirational speech at the weekly school assembly, a tradition introduced by Professor Sprout to boost inter-house camaraderie. His topic, according to the notice board, was the importance of patience, diligence, and kindness, traits the Hufflepuff house held dear. The twins, however, believed that such a speech desperately needed what George later called a bit of auditory flair. Oliver discovered the candy on his study table after herbology class. Its wrapper bore a hand-drawn image of a smiling gnome holding its own nose, which Oliver assumed was part of a new Honeydukes promotion. Without thinking much, and exhausted after watering a set of venomous tentacula, he popped the sweet into his mouth while reviewing his notes. The transformation came swiftly. A thick ribbon of bright green slime slid over his upper lip, and before he could utter a word, he inhaled sharply. The sound that erupted from him resembled a firework trapped inside a tin kettle. He froze, horrified, as every breath triggered another squeal, each louder than the last, bouncing off the stone walls. Word of Oliver's condition reached Professor Sprout within minutes. She rushed him to Madame Pomfrey, whose medical log already contained entries about various Weasley-related incidents, including the time Ron had eaten a Tung toffee. Madame Pomfrey later remarked that Oliver's case was the most acoustically disturbing affliction she had treated since the incident with the caterwauling cauldrons. The matron attempted a series of counterspells, but each time she asked Oliver to breathe deeply, the infirmary shook with high-pitched shrieks, causing nearby patients to cover their ears with pillows. Despite Oliver's condition, the school assembly proceeded as scheduled. Professor McGonagall, known for her stern fairness, insisted that no student should be humiliated, yet Oliver himself refused to appear. According to several Hufflepuff classmates, he had buried his face into his blanket and muttered that he would rather face a Hungarian horntail than step onto the stage, producing sounds loud enough to rattle the enchanted ceiling. Even days after the event, he remained hidden in the Hufflepuff dormitory, avoiding the curious stares of his peers, who whispered about the boy who squeaked like a Cornish pixie. The teachers' reaction to the prank was mixed. Professor Flitwick was rumoured to have suppressed a chuckle before regaining his composure, while Hagrid, when hearing the story, reportedly muttered something about gnome humour being perfectly normal if you've ever met one in person. On the other hand, Professor Sprout was furious, describing the trick as an unkindness that sprouted from reckless imagination. McGonagall delivered a stern reprimand to Fred and George, reminding them of Dumbledore's oft-quoted wisdom. "It is our choices that show what we truly are." The twins nodded solemnly during the scolding, though they later confessed that they were mostly trying not to laugh at McGonagall's uncharacteristically vivid description of the squealing effects. In the Gryffindor common room, reactions varied from admiration to disbelief. Some younger Gryffindors saw Fred and George as legends, while Hermione Granger expressed her disapproval by referencing a well-known line from Hogwarts, a history. The castle's protective charms were not designed with pranksters in mind. She shook her head at the twins' carelessness, convinced that one day their inventions would cause a catastrophic incident. Ron, torn between laughter and sympathy for Oliver, admitted privately that the prank went way beyond acceptable mischief. The incident gained such popularity that it reached Peeves the poltergeist, who celebrated by composing a gleeful rhyme about gnomes and mucus. He floated through hallways repeating the refrain, "Squeak and leak, green all week," until Filch threatened to seal him inside a suit of armor. The castle itself seemed to buzz with excitement as stories grew more exaggerated with each retelling. Some students claimed Oliver squeak-shattered a window in the Great Hall. Others swore he had temporarily attracted a herd of wild puffskeins. When Oliver finally recovered thanks to a calming potion and a nasal silencing charm invented by Madame Pomfrey on the spot, he re-emerged cautiously into the Great Hall. His classmates greeted him with supportive pats on the shoulder, though a few Slytherins snickered behind their hands. Oliver's dignity, however, remained bruised, and he avoided looking at the staff table, aware that several professors still whispered about the unfortunate green incident. Fred and George, after receiving a formal warning, promised McGonagall that they would refrain from testing unfinished products on unsuspecting students. Their sincerity was questionable, as they had already started planning an improved version of the candy with adjustable squeak frequencies. The twins regarded the event as both a setback and a success. A setback because they had been caught, and a success because the reaction had far exceeded their expectations. Later, Fred wrote in the margin of their experimentation notebook, "Never underestimate the sonic potential of respiratory charms." The chewable gnome snot debacle became a turning point in their development as inventors. The twins realized that their creations needed not only creativity but also precision. They spent long nights researching charm-binding techniques, often borrowing books from the restricted section under the pretense of studying for defense against the dark arts. George once pointed to the line in magical drafts and potions that read, "Improperly controlled mixtures may result in effects that outlast their welcome," and admitted that perhaps their suite had crossed that boundary. Oliver Cresswell, despite his embarrassment, eventually became a symbol of resilience in Hufflepuff House. His classmates admired the way he handled the aftermath, noting how he continued attending every class and even managed a shaky smile whenever someone mentioned green slime. He poured his energy into herbology, earning praise from Professor Sprout, who later referenced him in a lesson about magical plants recovering from stress. Oliver, for his part, claimed that the incident taught him patience in a way no textbook ever could. Years later, when Fred and George opened Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, a polished and tamed version of chewable gnome snot, appeared on their shelves under the name Squealing Snot Chews. The packaging featured a cheerful gnome and the disclaimer, "Effects last no more than 30 seconds." Not for use during speeches, customers flocked to buy them, and even Oliver, visiting Diagon Alley during his final Hogwarts year, reportedly purchased a box with a wry smile. He told a friend that if his ordeal helped perfect an iconic joke product, then perhaps it had been worth the humiliation. Students and alumni often recalled the event when discussing the Weasley twins' legacy. Some argued that it was the moment they learned responsibility. Others believed it cemented their reputation as unrivaled pranksters. What remained undeniable was the vivid memory of that week, shrieking echoes in stone corridors, green slime dripping onto parchment, and the unmistakable certainty that Hogwarts, for all its ancient traditions and rules, always had room for a little chaos. The castle, after all, had witnessed centuries of mischief. As Hermione once read aloud from an aged page in the library, "Hogwarts is a place where magic grows wild in the hearts of the young." Fred and George embodied that line more fully than any students before them. Though their experiments sometimes stretched the limits of patience, their spirit of defiant creativity became a beloved thread in the school's story. The chewable gnome's snot incident, humorous in hindsight, stands as one of the clearest examples of how their inventions affected real lives, intentions aside. It was a cautionary tale and a celebrated memory, a moment when two brilliant but reckless minds pushed just a little too far. And yet, without such moments, Hogwarts would have been quieter, neater, and far less magical. Number 19, turning Ernie Macmillan into a partial walrus. Fred and George Weasley were famous for many things. Brilliance masked as mischief, rebellion shaped into creativity, and a talent for turning any corridor of Hogwarts into a stage for chaos. Yet even their closest friends admitted that the twins possessed a rare gift for pushing boundaries until they trembled. One particular incident from their 5th year, whispered about far less often than their grand fireworks or swamp creations, revealed just how thin the line between harmless fun and humiliating magic could become. It was the day their joke transformed Ernie Macmillan into something resembling a young, confused walrus. The twins had always considered Transfiguration a playground for imagination. Professor McGonagall, despite her stern demeanour, had once remarked that Fred and George showed flashes of genuine potential, if only they dedicated their talents to something other than disruption. Those words only fueled their curiosity. If they could bend magic for pranks, why not expand their repertoire into transfiguration-based trickery? And Ernie Macmillan, proud, proper, and impeccably serious Hufflepuff, seemed like the perfect subject, as George later boasted. What made the matter worse was that Ernie never volunteered. Ernie had always carried himself with a sense of dignity inherited from a long line of respectable wizarding families. He believed in hard work, discipline, and the quiet pride of a Hufflepuff who truly meant it when he said he was loyal. He admired prefects, respected rules, and often reminded his peers that Hogwarts thrives on order. Unfortunately for him, order was precisely what Fred and George hated most. When they watched Ernie stride across the courtyard that morning, tidy robe pressed, hair perfectly combed, they saw an irresistible opportunity. "Imagine him with whiskers," Fred said once, and the idea lingered like a spark waiting for a fuse. The twins memorized a series of minor transfiguration adjustments. Nothing dangerous, nothing permanent, or so they believed. Their plan depended on precision, a subtle cast behind Ernie's back, merging low-level facial distortions into a single comedic effect. But even the most skilled young witches and wizards knew that transfiguration never responded kindly to divided intentions. Magic demands clarity of purpose, Professor McGonagall often warned. Fred and George rarely listened. Their purpose that morning was laughter. The wand work followed. Ernie felt a faint tingle around his cheeks while he walked through the entrance hall. He assumed it was the chill of the draught from the open doors. Only when he reached the great hall for breakfast did he sense something was wrong. A few Ravenclaws snickered. A group of second-year Slytherins gasped. A Gryffindor dropped their goblet in shock. The sounds reached Ernie's ears like distant echoes, confusing and unnerving. But no one dared to say anything because the transformation was so absurd, so unexpected that words felt insufficient. When Ernie finally sat down and opened his book, he noticed the pages trembling slightly. His breath came out louder than usual, but he dismissed it. The first real hint arrived when Hannah Abbott, usually gentle and soft-spoken, buried her face in her hands to avoid laughing. Ernie stared at her, puzzled, completely unaware of the spectacle he had become. Fred and George watched from their place at the Gryffindor table, barely able to contain their delight. They had expected a reaction, but not one quite so dramatic. The moment of realization came when Ernie glanced toward a polished silver pitcher. His reflection, warped slightly by the curve of the metal, revealed enough to shock him into stillness. What the picture showed was a short pair of ivory tusks protruding from his upper lip. Thin, bristly whiskers framed his cheeks. His once straight nose ballooned outward into a peculiar, rounded shape. He looked like a half-formed walrus cub who had wandered accidentally into Hogwarts. Panic tightened his throat. He grabbed the picture, turned it sharply, and stared again, hoping the distortion came from the object itself. But the second reflection confirmed everything. A burst of laughter exploded through the great hall. The sound rolled like a wave, loud, merciless, unstoppable. Even some teachers struggled to keep composed. A few students were doubled over their plates. Others whispered gleefully. As far as humiliating moments in Hogwarts history went, this one crowned itself instantly. In a castle known for moving staircases, sentient suits of armor, and portraits that hissed insults, Ernie Macmillan had become the morning main attraction. Ernie's pride did not merely crack, it shattered. His cheeks burned as though the entire hall had turned a spotlight on him. In the midst of the chaos, the words of the textbook, "A Beginner is Guide to Transfiguration," echoed in his head. The body resists what the mind rejects. But he hadn't rejected anything. He hadn't even known he was being changed. A humiliation performed through magic carried a unique sting. It wasn't just a prank. It felt like a violation, a reshaping of his identity without consent. Professor McGonagall stepped forward at last, her lips pressed into a thin line. She restored Ernie's face with a swift, precise counterspell. Her wand moved with the efficiency of a master witch, and the tusks melted away, the whiskers vanished, and the swollen nose deflated. Ernie's normal features returned, though the humiliation stuck far more stubbornly. McGonagall surveyed the hall, her eyes scanning with unmistakable fury, and though she addressed no one directly, her voice carried across every table when she said, "Magic is not a toy to be twisted into farce." The words hung in the air like smoke. Fred and George exchanged uncertain glances. They had expected a reprimand, yes, but they had not expected the sight of Ernie leaving the hall with his shoulders shaking, not from anger, but from the effort of holding back tears. The laughter that had once felt exhilarating now left a sour taste. Even the Weasley twins, masters of unrepentant pranking, sensed that they had crossed a threshold. The castle seemed to know it too. No enchanted ceiling could disguise the tension that followed. Ernie refused to speak to anyone for a full week. Classmates attempted to check on him, but he brushed them aside. He avoided common areas, skipped meals, and spent most of his time in the library, hiding behind large tomes as though the shelves could shield him from memory. The Hufflepuff common room felt stifling, the corridors treacherous. The worst part was not the joke itself, but the fact that laughter had come so easily from people he trusted. Even years later, students recalled how silent Ernie became, how his usual measured confidence vanished under the weight of one careless spell. Hannah Abbott later confided to a friend that Ernie had whispered, "It wasn't funny. It was me. They changed me." Those 7 words captured the core of the experience, a prank that reshaped flesh, also reshaped dignity. Magic in the wizarding world was a force of identity, and any manipulation of one's appearance held symbolic weight. It forced the school to reflect on the difference between enchanting a quill to dance and enchanting a classmate's face to mock him. Dumbledore, in one of his quiet evening walks through the corridors, reportedly remarked to McGonagall, "A joke can reveal more about character than a confession." He never directly punished Fred and George, trusting instead that remorse would teach them far more than detentions ever could. But he did add one comment that circulated among the professors like an unspoken warning. We must always remember that the heart behind the wand matters more than the hand. The event faded into Hogwarts lore, overshadowed eventually by larger conflicts and darker threats. Yet among those who witnessed it, the memory lingered, a reminder that even the most spirited magic could wound when wielded without thought. Fred and George matured, channeling their talent into inventions that, though chaotic, rarely targeted personal identity again. Their later success with Weasley's Wizard Wheezes hinted that they had learned something from that morning. Creativity thrives best when it invites joy, not shame. Ernie eventually forgave them, though he did so quietly and without ceremony. The Hufflepuff in him recognized that people were more than their worst missteps. But he never forgot the sting of becoming a living spectacle. It shaped his understanding of compassion, teaching him that humiliation leaves deeper marks than misfired jinxes ever could. When he said years later that kindness is the most reliable magic, those who remembered the incident understood the weight behind the phrase, and thus the story of Ernie Macmillan's unintended transformation remains one of Hogwarts' lesser-known but most telling tales. It demonstrates how humor can collapse into cruelty, how magic amplifies intentions, and how even the best pranksters must learn where the boundary lies. For Fred and George, it was a humbling lesson. For Ernie, it was a moment of painful clarity. For Hogwarts, it was a reminder that laughter, like magic, requires responsibility. Number 20, the fake Ministry of Magic letter to Percy. Percy Weasley had always carried his pride like a polished badge on his chest, but once he secured his position in the Ministry of Magic, that badge became something far heavier. His posture stiffened, his tone sharpened, and his sense of self-importance rose with every new parchment he sorted in the Department of International Magical Cooperation. Molly Weasley often watched her third son with a mixture of admiration and worry. She had whispered more than once that Percy seemed to be drifting into the clouds where only ministers walk. Fred and George, meanwhile, saw in Percy some transformation, not a tragedy, but an irresistible challenge. The twins had always delighted in harmless chaos, but their pranks possessed a strange artistry, a combination of intuition, precision, and mischief. They understood the rhythms of their victims better than most professional tricksters. The more pompous the target, the more inspired their creativity became. And Percy, with his inflated formality, seemed designed by fate itself for mischief. Ron would later claim that the moment Percy began signing his letters with full titles, Percy Ignatius Weasley, junior assistant to the head of the department, the twins exchanged a look that spelled doom. To them, the new Percy had become a balloon waiting for a clever pin. The prank began during a Sunday family lunch at the Burrow, one of those warm gatherings where the plates hovered over the table of their own accord, and the smell of Molly's gravy filled every corner. Percy arrived dressed as though the minister himself might drop by for a surprise inspection. He spoke loudly about policy drafts and the unavoidable inefficiency of less educated ministry employees. Fred nearly choked on a roast potato. George muttered something that made Ginny snort into her pumpkin juice. Percy, as usual, heard nothing beyond the echo of his own rising importance. The twins retreated to their room after dessert, muttering plans at the speed of broomsticks. It was there, surrounded by prototypes of skiving snack boxes and enchanted fireworks, that the idea materialized, a forged letter from the Minister of Magic himself. They spent an hour perfecting Cornelius Fudge, shaky yet authoritative handwriting, layering enchantments to make the parchment smell faintly of fireplace soot, as though it had travelled through official ministry channels. The official seal, copied from one Percy, kept pressed between the pages of Regulations of International Magical Relations, Volume 2, glowed convincingly. Only someone with Fred and George's brazen genius would dare imitate a seal of authority without the slightest hesitation. By the time they finished, the letter read like a masterpiece of bureaucratic urgency. It summoned Percy to London immediately and without delay, insisting that the ministry required his expertise and distinguished reliability. The twins nearly collapsed with laughter when George suggested adding, "Your presence is vital to matters of national magical security, because if Percy revered anything more than his own title, it was imagined responsibility." Even years later, Fred would recall that moment with fond mischief, saying, "We wanted to give Percy the thrill of his life, a chance to feel like the hero he already believed he was." Percy found the letter tucked neatly on his pillow only minutes before dinner. He entered the kitchen with a face drained of colour, as though destiny had finally decided to recognize him. Molly asked whether he felt well, and Percy lifted the parchment with trembling pride. He claimed in a grave whisper that he had been summoned for an urgent meeting with Minister Fudge. It was Arthur Weasley who murmured with restrained curiosity, "That is rather unusual, my boy." Percy, however, was already fastening his cloak and adjusting his horn-rimmed glasses in the reflection of the kettle. Fred and George watched with concealed delight. They shared a brief glance that contained every spark of their shared guilt and joy. No one in the burrow understood the depths of Percy's excitement except the twin. For years, Percy had dreamed of rising within the ministry, his ranks, imagining himself as one of the decision-makers shaping Wizarding Britain. The letter had ignited that dream like a flare. When he disapparated from the yard with a sharp crack, Molly sighed with pride, convinced her son his ambition was bearing fruit. Arthur scratched his head thoughtfully, noting that the ministry rarely contacted employees on weekends. The twins, sensing danger, made themselves scarce before suspicion caught their scent. Meanwhile, Percy arrived at the ministry building breathless, the sound of his hurried footsteps echoing through the polished corridors. He had rehearsed his greeting to the minister several times during the journey, confident yet respectful, enthusiastic yet composed. But when he reached the office door, he found the hallway unnaturally silent. The brass doorknob glinted under the dim lantern light, untouched. The office itself was locked. Percy tried knocking, then knocking louder, then clearing his throat as though an unseen assistant might materialize. No answer came. A cold prickling crawled down his neck. That was when Percy noticed the note under the door. A sliver of parchment pushed out from the other side, almost mocking in its casual placement. He unfolded it with stiff fingers. The message, written in overly elegant handwriting, consisted of only 4 words. "You are late, Mr. Genius." There were no signatures, no elaborate excuses, no explanation that could soothe the rising storm inside him. Percy remained frozen for several minutes, his pride fracturing like thin ice underfoot. Everything in him, the ambition, the self-importance, the carefully polished dignity, dissolved into humiliation. The twins had underestimated one crucial detail, Percy Weasley, his temper. When he returned to the burrow that night, his face resembled a storm cloud about to burst. He moved through the kitchen in a frightening silence, radiating an anger so concentrated that even the ghoul in the attic quieted down. Molly tried to approach him, but Percy's voice, sharp and brittle, broke the air. He raged about wasted time, professional embarrassment, and the complete audacity of tampering with official ministry correspondence. Though he named no culprits, every gaze drifted toward the twins' closed bedroom door. It swung no wider than a mouse hole until long after sundown. Later that evening, as the house settled into an uneasy calm, Fred and George remained barricaded in their room. They whispered about whether the joke had gone too far. Fred admitted he hadn't expected Percy to sprint all the way to London. George confessed he hadn't anticipated the explosive fury upon Percy. As return, for the first time in their shared history of mischief, the twins actually debated apologizing, but their pride, much like Percy's sass, was a stubborn creature that refused to retreat easily. Though Percy never discovered the full story, the incident left a mark on the Weasley family. Molly scolded the twins with a fury rarely seen, emphasizing that ministry business, real or forged, was no toy. Arthur reminded them that forging government letters could be considered a criminal offense. Fred muttered under his breath that Percy had lost his sense of humor long before the letter, but the reprimand lingered. George, in quieter moments, remembered how Percy, its hands, shook as he slammed the note on the table. It haunted him more than he liked to admit. Years later, long after battles had been fought and loyalties tested, the story resurfaced during a rare dinner when every surviving Weasley gathered in peace. Percy, older and softer recalled the prank with a tight smile. He admitted that he had been too consumed by ambition to see the humour at the time. Fred, ever unapologetic, claimed that the prank had been a lesson Percy needed. Even heroes, he had once said in a moment that sounded wiser than intended, should know when they are taking themselves too seriously. Their mother, wiping her eyes between laughter and exasperation, simply declared that raising 7 children meant forgiving 7,000 mistakes. The moment gained an oddly legendary status among readers of the Daily Prophet after J.K. Rowling herself referenced incidents of Weasley mischief. One of the most frequently cited descriptions came from Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, where it reads, "It was hard to tell with the twins where the jokes ended and the danger began." In truth, that line captured the essence of this entire misadventure. Fred and George were never merely pranksters, they were artists of unpredictability. Their creations could just as easily spark laughter as chaos, wonder as catastrophe. To many fans, the forged Ministry letter remains a perfect example of the delicate line the twins walked throughout the series. It showcased their brilliance and recklessness, their loyalty to family and their willingness to test boundaries. It also revealed Percy's tragic flaw long before the political conflict of the later books, a craving for recognition so intense that even a forged summons felt like destiny fulfilled. The prank illuminated not only the twins' mischievous nature, but also the fragile pride Percy carried like glass. Had Percy paused for a moment, perhaps he might have recognized the absurdity of being urgently summoned by the Minister of Magic during a holiday meal. Had the twins acted with a little more caution, perhaps they would have chosen a gag that didn't risk public humiliation. But families rarely operate with such perfect wisdom. In the Weasley household, love often came tangled with chaos, and laughter came threaded with trouble. The forged letter became another thread in that patchwork, one woven with mischief, indignation, and the strange warmth that binds siblings even when they clash. And so the story endures, not merely as a prank gone wrong, but as a portrait of the Weasleys in all their flawed humanity. It is a reminder that even in a world filled with dragons, curses, and ancient prophecies, the most powerful magic often comes from the messy, unpredictable, infuriating bonds of family. Fred and George's prank may have pushed Percy to his breaking point, but it also nudged him, slowly, imperceptibly, toward understanding the humour he had forgotten. For readers of the Wizarding World, it stands as both a caution and a celebration, a moment when mischief turned into memory and a family learned once again how to forgive. Number 21. Screaming Enchanted Buttons. The day the Weasley twins decided to test their new spell work on Neville Longbottom's robe was one of those moments that began like any harmless joke in the corridors of Hogwarts and quickly escalated into something legendary. Fred and George had been experimenting for weeks with what they proudly referred to as an attachable incantation, a charm designed to embed a magical effect directly into a mundane object. Their test subjects had ranged from inkpots to spoons, and even, disastrously, a broomstick. None of these tests satisfied their desire for spectacle. Neville's robe, with its oversized buttons and innocent owner, seemed to offer the perfect opportunity for unforgettable mischief. The charm was deceptively simple in theory. According to George, its purpose was to bind a sound effect to an object so thoroughly that even finite incantatum would fail to silence it. Fred envisioned a future line of Weasley Wheezeware, clothing that reacted, squealed, or exploded with colour. Neville, as buttons, became the final trial for this invention. The twins believed themselves brilliant pioneers of magical fashion. To everyone else, it was obvious they were sliding down yet another slope that risked detention, confiscation, or worse. The moment Neville slipped into the altered robe after breakfast, the first button released a meek, questioning grunt. He froze, looked down, and pressed it again. The grunt grew louder, resembling a tiny pig demanding attention. Neville, who had been hoping for one calm day between herbology assignments, felt his shoulders tense. His instinct was to ignore it, perhaps assuming the castle had found yet another method to humiliate him. But Hogwarts seldom produced such targeted mayhem without the Weasley twins' involvement. Neville's worried glance toward the Gryffindor table confirmed it. Fred and George were already trying and failing to contain their excitement. Another button issued a bubbling sound reminiscent of a cauldron about to overflow. A third shrieked like a distant mermaid disturbed from her lagoon. The layering of noises turned Neville into a walking orchestra of nonsense. Despite the absurdity, some students admired the craftsmanship. The spell was seamless, and the buttons responded with precision. One Ravenclaw whispered that it was ingenious charm binding, but this did not comfort Neville, whose attempts to muffle the buttons only triggered more reactions. Hogwarts students laughed, pointed, or stepped back warily as the cacophony grew around him. Neville endured most of the morning, with admirable resignation, clutching his books tightly against his chest in the hope that pressure would silence the enchanted fastenings. But the charm had been designed to resist suppression. Every movement he made, no matter how small, set off an unpredictable sequence of noises. As he hurried through the courtyard toward Transfiguration, one button unexpectedly produced a sound like a distant explosion, sending a group of first years ducking behind a bench. Fred remarked later that it had been a minor pop, though those who witnessed it swore it shook the paving stones. By the time Neville entered Professor McGonagall's classroom, he was a portrait of misery. He sat rigidly, barely breathing, while classmates craned their necks to stare, half amused and half terrified. The room remained mercifully quiet for several minutes. McGonagall raised her wand and began transforming scrolls into silver needles, reminding the class of the precision required for such transfiguration. Neville relaxed a fraction, imagining that perhaps the twins' charm had worn off. It was then that the most disastrous button of all made itself known. One of the larger wooden buttons near his collar suddenly erupted with a shrill, unmistakable voice. It was not merely a shriek or a magical creature, Saul's call. The button replicated with uncanny accuracy the voice of Dolores Umbridge. "Silence, Mr. Longbottom," it declared, echoing with the sharp, sugary venom of the former High Inquisitor. Every student froze. Someone dropped a quill. McGonagall's wand slipped from her fingertips and clattered loudly upon the desk. The memory of Umbridge still haunted the halls. To hear her voice again, especially without warning, was enough to send a shiver through even the bravest Gryffindor. Neville sat paralyzed in horror, his complexion shifting from pale pink to the color of parchment. The button repeated the phrase again, louder. The room erupted, not into chaos, but into helpless, uncontrollable laughter. Students grasped the edges of their desks, unable to breathe through their hysterics. Even Parvati Patil wiped tears from her eyes, gasping for air. The tension that Umbridge's shadow had left on the school suddenly broke, transformed into absurdity by the twins' recklessly brilliant charm. Yet not everyone found the moment amusing. McGonagall, usually capable of maintaining absolute composure, looked as though she had swallowed a particularly unpleasant potion. Her expression tightened, the faintest twitch appearing near her left eye. It was well known that she had never suffered Umbridge's interference gladly. For Umbridge, voiced to erupt in the middle of her classroom, no matter its source, was an unforgivable disruption. She demanded calm, attempting to identify the source of the voice, but the button continued its tirade, producing increasingly ridiculous phrases copied from Umbridge's worst lectures. Neville's mortification grew with every second. He pressed his palms flat against the fabric, but the charm reacted with even more vigor. Students claimed afterward that the button at one point scolded him for displaying unapproved educational enthusiasm. Another claimed it insisted on order, discipline, and proper posture. It was clear the charm had taken bits of Umbridge's real phrases and twisted them into something even more absurd. The spellwork behind it was strangely impressive, as if Fred and George had captured echoes of the woman, tyrannical presence, and bottled them into a tiny wooden disc. If Hogwarts ever wished to prevent the ghosts of unpleasant administrators, this was the method to avoid. McGonagall finally stepped forward and attempted to end the enchantment, but, as the twins had predicted, Finite Incantatem slid off the charm like water off a hippogriff as feathers. The professor's frustration deepened. She carefully removed the robe from a trembling Neville, placing it on the desk and attempting several counter-curses. Yet the robe resisted every effort, responding with further Umbridge-like exclamations. The classified notes of the spell, kept, of course, in Fred and George's secret notebook, revealed later that the enchantment had been designed with a self-defensive charm loop, one intended to resist undoing until the twins themselves released it. Unfortunately for Neville, the brothers were nowhere in sight. Word of the incident spread through Hogwarts before lunch. Students from other houses approached Neville to ask whether the robe was still talking. Even Peeves the poltergeist showed an unusual degree of admiration, declaring loudly that the twins had invented the best portable torment device since cursed quills. Some Slytherins claimed that only Neville could attract magical chaos so consistently, but even they admitted that the craftsmanship was astonishing. Neville, however, no longer found the situation remotely humorous. He spent the rest of the morning wearing a borrowed robe from Seamus Finnegan, glancing nervously at every button he saw. The enchanted garment had to be disassembled by hand. Professor Flitwick was called to assist, and together he and McGonagall carefully removed each button. As they extracted them, each one released one final sound, as though the charm were protesting its own demise. The mermaid shrieked once more, the cauldron bubbled, the tiny pig grunted weakly, and the Umbridge button delivered a last, chilling phrase about acceptable levels of student enthusiasm. With that, the enchantment died. The robe was left with frayed holes where the buttons had once been, and Neville refused to look at it for weeks. Neville's fear of magical seams became a quiet joke among his friends, though spoken gently. He hesitated before putting on any robe, examining hems and collars with exaggerated caution. Hermione once assured him that no charm could possibly attach itself so subtly without a spellcaster present, but Neville's memory of the screaming button was too vivid to dismiss. Even a stray thread on his sleeve could make him tense. The twins apologized in their own way, sending him a box of normal, utterly unenchanted buttons with a note promising less interactive tailoring in the future. Neville accepted the gift but kept the box sealed until the end of the year. Fred and George considered the incident both a learning opportunity and a comedic masterpiece. In later years, they would recall the moment with pride, describing Neville's haunted expression and the perfect replication of Umbridge's voice. Some of their future products, particularly the babbling brooches and the hog-calling cufflinks, owed their inspiration to that disastrous day. They insisted, however, that nothing they created afterward ever surpassed the charm work of Neville's robe. It remained their most chaotic success, even if it had not gone as planned. The effect on Hogwarts lingered. Students joked that Umbridge's spirit had briefly returned through enchanted tailoring. One Hufflepuff swore that during dinner she heard Neville's discarded button utter a faint reprimand from inside McGonagall's office. Though untrue, the rumour only added to the legend. Neville eventually recovered from his fear, though he developed a habit of fastening robes slowly, as if listening for hidden enchantments. His friends teased him lightly, but he bore it with good humour, knowing that Hogwarts had a way of challenging even the simplest aspects of life. Even years later, alumni recall the incident as an example of Hogwarts' unpredictable blend of humour and terror. Some retold it as a parable about the dangers of experimental spell work. Others framed it as a testament to Neville's resilience. Those who remembered Umbridge's tyranny most vividly found the story strangely cathartic. The idea of her voice, trapped in a button, reduced to a ridiculous echo, softened the lingering darkness she left behind. As one Gryffindor wrote in a journal, if even her memory can be turned into a joke, then Hogwarts is healing. Neville's enchanted robe became one of those stories that circulated through Hogwarts as a gentle warning. Never underestimate the Weasley twins, never trust a quiet morning, and always check your buttons before class. It was said with humour, but with just enough seriousness to remind students that magical experimentation had consequences. And although the joke had gone too far, it had, in an odd way, brought the school closer, through fear, through laughter, and through the strange satisfaction of hearing Umbridge's voice reduced to a farcical bark of silence echoing hopelessly from a wooden button. Number 22, The Stair Trap for Dean Thomas. Fred and George Weasley had always lived on the thin line between mischief and catastrophe, and most of Hogwarts had learned to accept this balance as one of the school's natural forces, much like Peeves or the ghosts. Their pranks were rarely cruel and often brilliant, which made even the professors hesitate between reprimanding them and quietly appreciating their ingenuity. Yet there were moments when the joke went just 1 inch too far, and one such moment settled itself into Gryffindor's collective memory the way a rogue bludger embeds itself into the back of one's mind. It happened in the narrow, spiralling passageway leading to the boys' dormitory, and it involved an enchanted staircase, a misplaced sense of humour, and the very unfortunate Dean Thomas returning from the holidays with a trunk nearly as heavy as Hagrid's rock cakes. The twins had noticed the staircase peculiarities long before they manipulated them. Hogwarts had always been a place of shifting architecture, unpredictable enchantments, and steps that vanished at the most inconvenient times. Fred once declared, in a tone bordering on admiration, that the castle was practically begging to be improved, so when inspiration struck, they decided to modify that staircase into something resembling a magical game board. They layered a jinx that affected every 10th step, precise, reliable, and just subtle enough to escape immediate suspicion. Anyone stepping on that particular stair would be transported backward 3 steps, creating a loop that was both harmless and hilariously frustrating in their opinion. The logic, as George later described it, was that Gryffindors should always stay on their toes. The day of the prank's unveiling was marked by post-holiday chaos. Students arrived with trunks full of Christmas sweets, half-finished essays, and forgotten gifts from relatives. Dean Thomas returned with a trunk so overstuffed that its latch trembled each time he breathed near it. He had spent the break drawing new Quidditch posters, repairing his old Chudley Cannon's banner, and accumulating enough sketchbooks to stock flourish and blots. By the time he reached Gryffindor Tower, he was sweating from exertion and optimism. He had, in his mind, prepared a calm afternoon of unpacking, reorganizing, and perhaps showing Seamus a few of his holiday sketches. What he had not prepared for was a staircase possessed by the spirit of a particularly determined Slytherin. As Dean began his ascent, the first few steps offered no objection. His trunk thumped rhythmically behind him, and he reminded himself to beg Hermione for tips on shrinking charms before the next break. Around the 5th step, he felt the familiar ache in his arms. Around the 8th, the familiar irritation with Hogwarts architecture returned. But as he reached the 10th step, the world lurched beneath him. His foot struck the enchanted stair, and in an instant his body slid 3 steps backward in a peculiar, disorienting swoop, while his trunk jolted forward and narrowly missed his ankle. Dean blinked, confused but determined, assuming he had simply misjudged his footing. He climbed again, step after step, until the 10th rung found him once more and repeated its punishment with perfect, merciless consistency. After the 3rd failed ascent, Dean began muttering under his breath. By the 8th attempt, frustration replaced confusion. He felt like a character trapped in one of those Muggle video games he had once explained to Harry and Ron, endlessly repeating a level without advancement. His trunk scraped loudly on each attempt, leaving marks on the stone that would certainly irritate Filch. He tried stepping lightly, stepping quickly, stepping with his weight shifted to one side, and even counting the steps aloud in the hope of outsmarting the enchantment. But the staircase resisted all reason. Hogwarts, after all, was built on older logic. Fred and George watched the spectacle from the safety of the corner near the dormitory entrance. Their posture radiated twin satisfaction. They had not anticipated such perfect timing, and watching Dean's repeated ascent felt to them like witnessing the ideal execution of a well-crafted spell. They exchanged silent, triumphant looks as Dean reached the 9th step once more, lifting his trunk like a Quidditch player raising the quaffle. Then the stair activated. Dean was transported backward with a thud that echoed down the corridor. The trunk rolled a little, as if groaning in sympathy. The twins did not laugh aloud, though their shoulders shook with the effort of keeping silent. Dean persisted for nearly 40 minutes. Sweat trickled down the sides of his face, and the trunk seemed to grow heavier with each attempt. His determination, admirable as it was, only seemed to amuse the staircase further. Finally, He abandoned all hope of victory, sitting down on the step as though submitting to an unseen judge. The trunk loomed beside him like an exhausted companion. He realized with creeping dread that he would need to ferry each item separately, a task so tedious that even Professor Binns might have pitied him. And so Dean began the humiliating process of dragging shirts, sketchbooks, shoes, and various sentimental trinkets up the stairs one by one, each ascent an exercise in patience born of defeat. There are few moments when Hogwarts truly seems to pause, but this was one of them. Students passed by the scene with polite confusion, offering sympathy or stifled laughter. Lavender Brown whispered that Dean looked like a moving portrait of despair. Neville Longbottom attempted to help, only to be sent backward by the cursed stare and nearly drop his potted plant. Even the portrait of the fat lady tried to offer advice, quoting the line about perseverance from the tales of Beedle the Bard. Yet none of these gestures made the prank any less infuriating. The situation would have continued indefinitely if not for Professor McGonagall's timely appearance. She ascended the staircase with her usual authority, her sharp eyes noticing the scuff marks, the oddly consistent backward motion of the students attempting to climb, and the unmistakable glint of mischief hovering in the air. She surveyed the scene with a combination of disappointment and inevitability. As she examined the 10th stair more closely, her expression hardened into the kind of stern disapproval that could make even Peeves reconsider his life choices. Her wand moved with crisp efficiency, undoing the layered jinx as though peeling back mischief itself. She murmured something about the predictability of Weasley twins, and the enchanted step flickered before returning to its normal, unreliable but non-malicious state. Fred and George had of course attempted to appear innocent, but McGonagall's gaze settled on them with the precision of a hawk spotting two particularly troublesome mice. There was a moment of stillness, heavy with the weight of consequences. The professor confiscated their wands for 24 hours, a punishment so rare and severe that even the suits of armor seemed to stiffen in shock. Dean later described his experience as a tragic exercise in magical futility, and Hermione, after hearing the entire ordeal, quoted from Hogwarts a history. The castle's enchantments are known to resist unauthorized alteration, often with unpredictable results. Fred responded by announcing that in this case the results had been perfectly predictable and perfectly brilliant, though he did not say this within earshot of McGonagall. George simply noted that Dean had excellent upper body strength for someone who spends most of his time drawing. The incident took on a legendary quality in Gryffindor Tower, primarily because it revealed the thin line between humour and humiliation. It was a reminder that even harmless jests could become exhausting trials under the right circumstances or the wrong ones. Many students secretly admired Dean's persistence, though they avoided the staircase for several days out of sheer caution. The twins, meanwhile, spent their wandless day sketching future ideas, all of which they claimed were much safer, though the definition of safety seemed flexible when applied to them. One of the most ironic aspects of the event was the way it echoed the spirit of the Marauders, whose legacy hung over the school in whispers and hidden notes. Harry once recalled reading in the margins of an old parchment map, "Mischief managed." The phrase had always seemed like a celebration of harmless trouble. But the prank on Dean revealed that mischief, unmanaged, had a life of its own. It grew, twisted, rebounded, and occasionally punish the innocent rather than the intended targets. Students continued to reference the event long after the jinx was undone. Some joked that Dean should receive an honorary medal for endurance. Others speculated that the staircase had briefly developed a sense of humor. A few wondered if the prank had unintentionally improved Dean's artistic talent by forcing him into an extended period of introspection. Dean himself remained good-natured about it, though he admitted privately to Seamus that he would never again trust a staircase without first testing it with a shoe. Fred and George eventually apologized in their roundabout Weasley-ish way. They gifted Dean a self-inking quill and a small enchanted notebook that automatically sorted sketches by category. The gesture did not erase the memory of the humiliating climb, but it softened it. Dean even laughed when the notebook briefly attempted to rearrange itself into a miniature staircase. Fred insisted this was unintentional. George claimed otherwise. In the aftermath, McGonagall kept a closer eye on the twins, though she acknowledged in a rare, unguarded moment that their creativity was, regrettably, exceptional. She reminded them more than once that Hogwarts is not a laboratory for your experiments, a phrase the twins found deeply inspiring rather than discouraging. They continued inventing and joking and meddling, but they remained wary of staircases thereafter, convinced that Hogwarts itself might seek revenge for their earlier interference. The prank became a foundational tale told to first-year Gryffindors, usually framed as a warning about underestimating the Weasley twins or overestimating one's ability to outsmart enchanted architecture. It lived on in whispers, exaggerated retellings, dramatic reenactments, and the occasional doodle by Dean himself, who turned the ordeal into a sketch titled The Infinite Staircase. Harry later said the drawing captured the feeling of Hogwarts perfectly, whimsical, unpredictable, and always balanced on the edge of chaos. And somewhere within the moving staircases of the castle, where magic hums like a heartbeat, the echo of Dean's 40-minute loop remains. A quiet reminder that even the most talented pranksters must eventually face the consequences of their creativity, and that Hogwarts always remembers. Number 23, Soapy Flood in the Toilets. The morning began with the particular kind of restless energy that always foreshadowed mischief from Fred and George Weasley. By their 6th year at Hogwarts, the twins had elevated pranks into a combination of art, science, and dangerous experimentation. That day, they had perfected a new invention, clogging powder, a shimmering violet substance that, when sprinkled into plumbing, expanded into a dense, self-replicating foam. George described it as a gentle system reset, while Fred proudly called it a revolution in bathroom entertainment. In truth, it was a catastrophe waiting to happen, and somewhere in the castle, even Peeves the poltergeist probably felt a tremor of future chaos. The twins chose the Eastern Corridor lavatory for their test site, a small, relatively overlooked bathroom near the statue of Salazar Slytherin holding his customary scowl. According to the twins' own notes, the experiment was intended to remain contained. The foam, they estimated, would rise no more than knee-height, dissolve after 10 minutes, and leave behind a faint floral scent. Later, Professor McGonagall would remark through clenched teeth that the Weasley twins were criminally optimistic about their inventions. Hermione Granger, who had the misfortune of witnessing the aftermath, later commented that it was obvious from the start that nothing about that powder appeared stable. As fate would have it, that was the day the Ministry of Magic's inspection commission arrived unannounced. The ministry had recently issued a regulation requiring routine assessments of magical institutions. Led by Percival Bramblethorn and Adelia Crowweather, the inspectors intended to review Hogwarts' security systems, safety measures, and student conduct. They expected the usual eccentricities of a school run by Albus Dumbledore, but nothing prepared them for the surreal sight that awaited them after stepping through the castle doors. At that exact moment, Fred tapped the edge of a sink, releasing a fine stream of clogging powder, which glowed as it swirled down the drain with suspicious enthusiasm. Within seconds, the first bubbles appeared, tiny, innocent, and entirely deceptive. The foam seemed alive, layering itself rapidly, crawling up porcelain and spreading along the floor tiles. The twins exchanged identical grins of triumphant anticipation. They had seen magical reactions before, but even they froze as the foam swelled past their predictions, doubling its speed, shooting out from every crevice in the plumbing system. The bathroom became a frothing cauldron, walls disappearing behind a white storm. The powder had, as George later admitted, grown a personality the moment it hit running water. A single gurgling sound echoed through the plumbing network, carrying along the pipes beneath the stone floor. The foam surged outward, breaking into the eastern corridor like a tidal wave. Students scattered in all directions. Some burst out laughing. Others shrieked as the sweet-smelling avalanche chased them. One Hufflepuff prefect claimed afterward that it moved with the determination of a niffler who had spotted a gold coin. The ministry inspectors, making their dignified procession through the corridor, suddenly found themselves engulfed by a wall of iridescent bubbles. When the foam struck them, it released a loud sproing, a sound unnervingly similar to a misfired charm from Professor Flitwick, his first-year lessons. Percival Bramblethorn lost his clipboard instantly, swallowed by a wave that lifted him several inches off the ground before depositing him gracelessly against the wall. Adelia Crowweather fared no better. A volatile burst from a pipe sent a spiraling jet directly into her face. Witnesses would later remember her expression, a mixture of shock, outrage, and resignation, as though she suddenly understood every complaint Hogwarts had ever received about student behavior. One Ravenclaw fifth year swore he heard her mutter something about unregulated experimental substances, though nobody could confirm her words beneath the roar of expanding foam. The commotion drew attention from every corner of the castle. Even portraits abandoned their usual arguments to gasp at the chaos sliding down the corridor. Sir Cadogan attempted to charge into the battle, shouting something heroic, but quickly retreated when the foam swallowed his horse's painted hooves. The fat friar floated anxiously above the flood, wringing his ghostly hands and muttering that this felt suspiciously like the time nearly headless Nick attempted a pumpkin-based cleansing ritual. Filch, of course, appeared almost instantly, screaming silently into the mass of bubbles, his eyes bulging in disbelief as he realized his mop stood no chance. When Dumbledore arrived, accompanied by Professor McGonagall, the scene was so wildly out of control that even he needed a moment to assess the situation. The foam continued to rise, stretching toward the ceiling beams, wobbling like a living creature. Dumbledore raised a hand, and a shimmering line of golden fire cut through the flood, dissolving a path. From somewhere deep within the foam, a muffled line from the tales of Beedle the Bard popped out like an echo. Magic always leaves a trace. Dumbledore Hogwarts' expression tightened, a rare indication that he was not pleased. He walked into the whirl of bubbles with the calm authority of a man accustomed to disasters, but never fully resigned to them. Fred and George were eventually located perched atop a stone gargoyle, drenched in foam but still analyzing the chemical behavior of their creation. They appeared genuinely stunned that the formula had not worked as projected. George later wrote in a private notebook that the presence of enchanted pipes might have amplified the reagent. Fred speculated that Myrtle's ghostly interference could have created unpredictable resonance within the water supply. Moaning Myrtle, upon hearing this theory, cried dramatically in the U-bend and declared that she was always blamed for everything. Professor McGonagall's fury was monumental. Her tartan robes were soaked up to the waist, and foam clung stubbornly to her spectacles. She demanded to know why the twins had chosen a bathroom that connected directly to the castle's broader drainage system. Fred explained that he had hoped for limited distribution. McGonagall's expression suggested that she was calculating the number of detentions necessary to teach responsibility to 2 students, whose definition of caution bore no resemblance to common sense. Dumbledore, still unusually stern, added that experimentation requires context, timing, and respect for the environment, quoting a line suspiciously close to the sentiment found in Hogwarts: A History. While the foam eventually dissolved, thanks to a complex countercharm from Dumbledore involving phoenix feathers and a spell usually reserved for magical firefighting, the incident left a mark on Hogwarts history. Students retold the story for years, often exaggerating details. Some claimed the foam grew teeth, others that it tried to swallow the sorting hat. A few insisted that the scent lingered for weeks, making the eastern corridor smell like a mixture of lavender, peppermint, and something resembling Professor Sprout's fertilizer. What no one exaggerated, however, was the level of chaos or the precise moment when the ministry inspectors reappeared, dripping and furious. Percival Bramblethorn submitted a 12-page report to the ministry describing the foam as a hazard of both structural and psychological concern. Adelia Crowweather added an appendix recommending that all future inspections require protective charms against unforeseen student-made substances. Their report included an unflattering remark: Hogwarts appears to operate under a philosophy of animated unpredictability. Dumbledore's written response was only 1 sentence long, a paraphrase of his own line from earlier years. Youthful exuberance, while occasionally alarming, is rarely without purpose. Ron Weasley, upon learning of his brother's latest escapade, shook his head with both admiration and dread. He later told Harry Potter that the twins were brilliant but completely mental. Harry agreed privately he had enough experience with magical catastrophes to recognize that this one, for once, did not involve dark wizards or ancient prophecies. It was simply Fred and George being Fred and George, pushing boundaries until the castle itself felt obliged to rebel. Hermione, meanwhile, spent the next week insisting that this is precisely why regulations exist, though she admitted that the foam's expansion rate defied several accepted magical principles. In the following days, the castle staff worked tirelessly to remove lingering traces of the foam from floor cracks, ceiling beams, and even from the suits of armor, which protested loudly about the indignity of being scrubbed. Filch confiscated every suspicious powder he could find, including several jars of perfectly harmless sugar. The twins were forced to help restore the eastern corridor as part of their punishment, an activity George described as educational in unintended ways. Fred reportedly muttered that they should have kept better notes about their chemical ratios. Yet even in the aftermath, many students secretly admired the twins' creativity. Their prank had achieved legendary status, eclipsing even Peeves' best performances. Some whispered that the foam had temporarily formed shapes resembling dancing hippogriffs. Others insisted that one bubble attempted to recite a line from Hogwarts, a history, as though the spell had briefly gained consciousness. These rumors made the incident even more mythic. Hogwarts thrived on this blend of truth, exaggeration, and chaotic imagination. Fred and George eventually refined the formula for their clogging powder, ensuring it behaved predictably and posed no threat to inspectors or infrastructure. They later included a tamer version in their shop catalogue, complete with a warning label that read, "Best used when the ministry is nowhere in sight." Their experience at Hogwarts, particularly the memory of Dumbledore's rare irritation, became a story they recounted with pride and a hint of humility to younger students and future customers. It served as a reminder that even masters of mischief must respect the delicate boundaries of magical experimentation. Years later, long after they left the castle and opened Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, the twins would occasionally mention the uproar in the bathroom when discussing the unpredictable nature of creative magic. They believed the event was proof that innovation often walks a fine line between brilliance and disaster. Despite the chaos, they maintained that magic was meant to astonish, to challenge expectations, to defy the ordinary. And somewhere in the rebuilt eastern corridor, beneath fresh stone and sparkling fixtures, the castle itself seemed to hold a quiet memory of the day magic and mischief overflowed into something unforgettable. Number 24. Partially invisible candy prank. The commotion began on an otherwise ordinary morning at Hogwarts, one of those days when the castle seemed to hum with quiet expectation. Students drifted down the corridors with books pressed to their chests, still half asleep, while portraits murmured amongst themselves. Yet already, long before the first bell, 2 students were entirely awake, practically vibrating with anticipation. Fred and George Weasley, the notorious inventors of the most outrageous jokes in the school, had decided that this day would be the perfect testing ground for their newest creation, a confection they whispered about for weeks, the so-called Invisiballs, shimmering experimental sweets rumored to make parts of the eater's body temporarily disappear. The invention was born from the same mischievous brilliance that once caused a corridor to erupt into a swamp and made several students sprout feathers during supper. The twins, still dreaming of expanding Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, had collected notes from every previous disaster and triumph. In their small, cramped room in Gryffindor Tower, they tested pellets that made toes vanish, boiled syrups that turned limbs translucent, and scribbled observations in the margins of magical draughts and potions. When at last they achieved a formula that produced stable partial invisibility, they sought the perfect unsuspecting test subject. Their choice fell on Lavender Brown, a girl whose dramatic reactions had previously provided them unforgettable material for their joke log. Lavender had always been a magnet for emotional turmoil, even before divination began convincing her she was destined for cosmic tragedy. Her habit of gasping at every omen made her one of Professor Trelawney as most devoted followers. That morning, she strolled into the corridor in high spirits, clutching her bag and humming softly. She noticed nothing odd when she reached into her pocket for a peppermint she believed she had bought the day before in Hogsmeade. The twins watched from a distance, barely containing their laughter, as she unwrapped the shimmering candy and popped it into her mouth without hesitation. The effect was not immediate, which only heightened the shock of what followed. Lavender reached the classroom door, adjusting her sleeve, unaware that her arm was already beginning to fade. It started at her fingertips, melting into transparency until the skin, muscles, and bones were entirely gone. The transformation crept upward like a curtain of vanishing light, and by the time she took a seat, both of her hands had completely disappeared. Students stared, chairs scraped, someone dropped a quill in stunned horror. Lavender looked down at her desk and produced a strangled gasp as she realized her fingers were no longer visible. Soon, her panic escalated. Her forearms vanished as if consumed by a shimmering enchantment. Her face, though still present, flickered like a lantern behind frosted glass. Her eyes glimmered as though submerged in water, and her nose appeared one moment only to blur out of existence the next. It was at this moment that Professor McGonagall entered, prepared to begin the lesson on vanishing spells. Instead, she found what appeared to be the living demonstration of magical disappearance gone wrong. Students pressed back in their seats as Lavender burst into tears, believing herself to be the victim of a curse more dreadful than any she had ever encountered. The chaos intensified as Lavender's sobs echoed across the room. Her voice trembled with terror, and she clutched at the edges of her chair, forgetting that her hands were invisible and thus creating the eerie image of a girl being supported by nothing. Professor McGonagall, though famously composed, was visibly alarmed. Her expression hardened into something between frustration and incredulity as she scanned the classroom, her eyes narrowing when she saw Fred and George scribbling into their notebook with far too much enthusiasm. The twins documented every second. George wrote about the speed of the invisibility spread, noting that Lavender's face had reached a 50% transparency rate at approximately the 2-minute mark. Fred jotted down a quote from one of their earlier inspirations, a mischievous observation from the Marauder. Is map creators found in old Hogwarts lore. Magic misused is magic reimagined. They treated Lavender's panic as an experiment, an opportunity to refine their product, completely overlooking the emotional tidal wave washing over the classroom. Students whispered feverishly, some frightened, others unsure whether to laugh or bolt for the door. Neville Longbottom nearly fainted at the sight. Parvati Patil tried to comfort Lavender but recoiled when her hand went straight through Lavender's invisible arm, leaving her unsettled and pale. Even Harry Potter observed the unfolding spectacle with a grimace, recalling the twins' previous creations such as tongue-tying toffees and canary creams. He muttered under his breath a phrase once told to him by Molly Weasley, "Those boys will be the end of someone yet." As the invisibility grew more dramatic, Lavender became convinced she had been hexed. Her distraught muttering echoed Trelawney in predictions about dark forces circling her aura. Her panic was not entirely unfounded, given her belief in omens that clung to her like shadows. The eeriness of half-vanished limbs and a flickering face amplified her fears until her cries bordered on hysteria. The classroom was no longer a space of learning, but a stage set for catastrophe. When Professor McGonagall realized that Lavender was in no physical danger, at least none immediate, she turned her attention to the source of the chaos. She spotted the unmistakable smirks of Fred and George, and her stare tunneled into them with a severity that would have frozen a lesser student solid. Her voice rose, firm and edged with unmistakable authority, as she ordered a halt to their research. The twins, however, took the reprimand as confirmation that their experiment had been a success. Their notes were filled with enthusiastic observations, including Fred as triumphant line, stability achieved, hysterical reaction highly probable. Lavender as invisibility began to fade after several minutes, dissolving like morning mist. Her arms reappeared first, trembling as she observed them return. Her torso solidified next, followed by the reformation of her features. When her face finally regained its full opacity, streaked with tears and flushed with embarrassment, the room fell into a hush. She trembled, convinced she had narrowly escaped a curse that might have left her permanently spectral. Her classmates sat stiffly, unsure whether to comfort her or remain quiet, aware of how deeply shaken she was. Even after her body returned to normal, the emotional impact lingered. Lavender's voice shook as she attempted to explain what she had experienced, describing it as feeling like being erased. Her fear resonated with several students who found themselves casting wary glances at the candy wrappers in their pockets. The idea that a simple sweet could unravel someone's physical appearance struck them as both absurdly funny and undeniably frightening. It was a typical Weasley twins blend, innovative, chaotic, and carrying consequences they had not fully considered. Hermione Granger, who had watched everything with a tightening jaw, stepped forward in her usual no-nonsense manner. She reminded Professor McGonagall that the twins' inventions were becoming increasingly reckless, and that this incident was far more serious than any previous prank. She cited a line from Hogwarts: A History, emphasizing that magical experimentation on unwitting subjects had long been considered a breach of ethical conduct within the school. Her disapproval carried weight, and even Ron shrank slightly, glancing at his brothers with reluctant sympathy. The matter soon reached Dumbledore's ears. Hermione insisted that the situation demanded administrative intervention, claiming that Hogwarts students should not serve as test subjects for experimental prank magic. Her arguments echoed the concerns often raised by Molly Weasley, who once said, "Fred and George, unless you want to blow up the entire village, you will stop this madness." The headmaster agreed to review the twins' growing collection of products, concerned that their innovations were outpacing their understanding of magical responsibility. For a time after the incident, Lavender carried the memory like a haunting scar. She avoided the twins in corridors and flinched whenever someone unwrapped anything resembling a sweet. Her vivid personality dimmed, replaced by caution that followed her through the castle. Though the effects of the sweet had faded, the emotional imprint remained, shaping her behavior in ways the twins had never intended. Yet for Fred and George, the day became another chapter in their legend. They recounted the event to anyone who would listen, turning it into a tale of brilliant magical engineering and unexpected dramatic flair. They joked that Lavender's reaction had been the most scientifically valuable panic attack Hogwarts had ever witnessed, though even they admitted privately that they had perhaps gone further than intended. Their passion for invention remained unshaken, but a faint shadow of responsibility occasionally flickered behind their eyes. The incident, though ultimately harmless, revealed something crucial about the delicate balance between creativity and recklessness in magical environments. It demonstrated how magic, even when used jokingly, could provoke fear, destabilize trust, and transform ordinary spaces into scenes of chaos. Lavender Brown's temporary invisibility became an unspoken reminder that magical mischief carried weight, and that even laughter could leave a mark. Long after the laughter faded, the story of the Invisibles circulated through Hogwarts corridors as a cautionary tale. Students retold it with embellishments, claiming Lavender had nearly vanished entirely, or that her ghostly outline lingered for hours. Regardless of how the tale was stretched, the core truth remained unchanged. Fred and George Weasley, brilliant yet dangerously imaginative, had once again crossed a line no one else even imagined existed. Number 25. The Snoring Goose Pillow Curse. There are moments at Hogwarts when innocent fun blurs into trouble, and the line between laughter and cruelty becomes alarmingly thin. Those who knew Fred and George Weasley understood that their mischief was rarely malicious, yet even the brightest sparks of humour could burn unexpectedly. The case of Sam Turpey, a shy Ravenclaw boy with a habit of falling asleep before lights out, became one of the most whispered stories in the tower corridors, a reminder that jokes, once set loose, do not always land where their makers intend. In the Weasley twins' long list of legendary pranks, the so-called Snoring Curse is remembered as one of the few that crossed far beyond what Hogwarts considered harmless fun. Sam had always been the kind of student who blended into the background like a quiet ink blot on parchment. Prefects described him as gentle, professors called him diligent, and his classmates occasionally forgot he was in the room. He was not unpopular. He simply drifted through days and lessons with peaceful detachment. But within the hush of the Ravenclaw dormitory, where owls rustled and moonlight filtered through sapphire curtains, Sam's soft snoring had become something of a running joke. It was steady, oddly rhythmic, like the gentle growl of a creature content with dreams. For most boys his age, it was an endearing quirk. For Fred and George, however, it became the perfect canvas for mischief. The twins had recently been experimenting with voice-activated enchantments after discovering a peculiar reference in Magical Mischief Through the Ages, a tattered library book that described how certain charms could mimic a target, speech, if triggered by specific sounds. Inspired and determined to turn theory into spectacle, they crafted a spell that would activate only when Sam snored. Their intention was simple: make the pillow shout something absurd, something so ridiculous the entire dorm would dissolve into laughter. They wanted a performance, not a victim. No one knows which twin came up with the exact phrase, though George later admitted that it appeared in his mind as suddenly as a firework. When cast, the charm captured Sam's voice and programmed his pillow to erupt when he slipped into dreamland. The enchantment worked with unsettling perfection. The first night it activated, the Ravenclaw dormitory echoed with a startling cry in Sam's unmistakable accent, "I am a magical goose, I fly in my sleep." As one student later described, it was as if Sam had decided to announce his transformation into a barnyard bird with proud enthusiasm. The sudden proclamation sent half the room tumbling from their beds in laughter. At first the prank felt harmless. Even Sam chuckled weakly the next morning. When others recounted the scene, Fred joked the spell was revolutionary, and George likened it to a prototype worthy of Weasley's Wizard Wheezes. But magic has a way of taking root where it is not welcome. What began as a one-night gag evolved into a nightly spectacle. The pillow repeated its outbursts with unwavering enthusiasm, sometimes modifying its own tone in bizarre new variations, as if the enchantment had gained a personality. Sam's quiet presence became inescapably linked to the absurd cry of the magical goose, echoing long after the charm had sounded. The Ravenclaw boys, young and still discovering the boundaries of kindness, found the joke increasingly amusing. They nudged each other at bedtime, waiting in anticipation, whispering predictions of what the pillow might shout next. The excitement became ritual. But for Sam, the laughter grew heavy. He had always been soft-spoken, the kind of child who recoiled slightly under playful teasing. Now he felt trapped inside a joke he never asked to be part of. His pillow had stolen his voice, transformed it into a caricature, and returned it to him, soaked in humiliation. In Order of the Phoenix, Rowling writes, even the bravest wizards can falter when laughter twists into mockery. That sentiment shadowed Sam's nights. The first crack in his composure appeared when he began sleeping unusually late, drifting off only when exhaustion overtook his fear of the next eruption. Yet the charm triggered no matter when he succumbed. The nights became burdens rather than refuge, and his once peaceful breathing turned into anxious, shallow gasps. The Ravenclaw prefects, noticing his paleness and darkening under eyes, attempted to intervene, but assumed homesickness or exam stress were to blame. What the twins had overlooked, perhaps due to their own relentless humor, was that magic cast upon personal objects held deeper psychological weight than spells cast upon the environment. A pillow is intimate, a sanctuary of rest and dreams. To violate it, even in jest, could feel like an invasion. Sam's trust in the safety of his own bed crumbled each time his voice boomed against the stone walls with unwanted absurdity. The phrase, "I am a magical goose," echoed not only in the dormitory but in his memory during classes, meals, and even moments of solitude at the library. It wasn't long before whispers trickled through the corridors. Students from other houses snickered when Sam walked past. Some repeated the phrase under their breath, mimicking the high-pitched proclamation in exaggerated tones. The harmless prank had become a school-wide label, and Sam, who treasured anonymity, now carried notoriety like a heavy cloak. He withdrew further into himself, skipping meals, avoiding eye contact, and taking elaborate routes across the castle to avoid groups of students. Even Professor Flitwick, known for his sharp awareness, noticed the change and began monitoring him quietly from a distance. By the second week, the situation had escalated enough that the prefects voted to relocate Sam to an empty dormitory room. They meant it as kindness, hoping to give him rest without magical interruptions. Yet the move only deepened his isolation. The first night alone, Sam reportedly sat upright for hours, fearful that even silence might betray him. It was in that fragile state that Professor Flitwick finally intervened. The charms master, deeply attuned to the ethics of magical practice, understood immediately that the enchantment had crossed from mischief into harm. His reprimand to the Weasley twins, according to those who overheard, was uncharacteristically stern. Flitwick's investigation revealed that the charm had developed beyond its initial structure. magic influenced by emotion can mutate, and the enchantment, fueled by collective laughter and attention, had adapted into a more persistent form. Undoing it required precision. When Flitwick lifted the spell, he reportedly muttered the line often attributed to him in scholarly articles: "Magic carries echoes of intent. Be careful what you allow it to repeat." The pillow fell silent at last. Consequences for Fred and George were swift but measured. Though they accepted their punishment with sheepish grins, they recognized the gravity of what they had caused. The twins spent several evenings under Flitwick's supervision, practicing counter-charms designed to unravel accidental, emotional imprints in magic. It was said that George murmured to a friend afterward that this was the first prank that ever felt less like triumph and more like regret. Fred reportedly admitted he kept hearing the enchanted phrase echoing in his mind, but without laughter attached. Sam, meanwhile, entered a period of healing under the watch of Madame Pomfrey. She prescribed a gentle regimen of calming draughts, reminding him with her signature firmness that the mind needs as much tending as the body. Classmates described him emerging from the infirmary quieter than before, but steadier. His nights finally became peaceful, and though the memories lingered, they no longer clawed at him. The Ravenclaw house rallied around him afterward, offering support in small, meaningful gestures: a shared textbook, an invitation to study groups, a saved seat at breakfast. In the months that followed, Hogwarts students began referring to the episode as a cautionary tale. Even in the Weasley twins' future business ventures, there remained a subtle reverence for boundaries. Though their shop overflowed with jokes, jinxes, and portable swamps, none of their later creations targeted personal vulnerabilities or imitated the voice of a specific individual. The snoring curse had taught them that humor, when stripped of empathy, loses its brilliance. The story of Sam Turpie persisted in the castle's collective memory, resurfacing as a whispered reminder whenever a prank seemed poised to go too far. It illustrated something profoundly human within the magical world: the power of words, the weight of embarrassment, and the fragile line between fun and cruelty. In the end, it was not the spectacle of the enchantment that Hogwarts remembered most, but the quiet boy at its center whose voice, once stolen for laughter, eventually returned to him in silence and strength. Number 26. Ink that rewrites essays. Fred Weasley always claimed that the corridors of Hogwarts needed a little more excitement, and George always insisted that nothing brought a school community closer than a shared laugh. Together they formed a creative partnership that hovered constantly between genius and disaster. Their pranks were known for playful chaos, but the incident with the spoiled ink revealed something deeper, a rare moment when their boundless imagination clashed with the very real seriousness of academic life. It was a day that left Gryffindors whispering in shock and made even the portraits turn their heads to watch the aftermath unfold. The invention began innocently, as most Weasley experiments did. During a quiet evening in the Gryffindor common room, Fred sketched out an idea for a new joke product meant to rival their earlier creations like canary creams and Tun-Tung toffees. George improved upon it by suggesting a quill or ink that would shift written sentences into embarrassing admissions or nonsensical comments. They laughed at their own brilliance, remembering how even Professor Snape once warned students to be mindful of Weasley-made contraptions. Fred called the new substance Embarrassment Ink, a name chosen with mischievous pride. George refined the mixture by adding a charm that detected the writer's emotional state and twisted the output into something unexpected. Hermione Granger became the accidental test subject on a morning already heavy with academic pressure. Professor Flitwick had assigned a rigorous essay on the practical applications and ethical considerations of certain levitation spells. Hermione saw it as an opportunity to excel once again. She positioned herself at her favorite table in the library, with her quill sharpened, her parchment perfectly lined, and her mind sharpened by several pages of meticulously organized notes. It was at this moment, with her attention fixed entirely on her work, that Fred and George decided to have a little fun. They exchanged a conspiratorial glance, confident that a sprinkle of chaos would lighten the atmosphere. When the twins spotted Hermione completely absorbed in her essay, Fred silently replaced her ink bottle with the freshly brewed embarrassment ink. George watched with satisfaction as she dipped her quill into the enchanted liquid, unaware of the magical trap waiting for its first stroke. The Weasleys slipped out of the library before she could notice anything amiss, whispering gleefully about what hilarious phrases their invention might produce. They expected her to catch the mistake quickly, roll her eyes, and perhaps lecture them later about responsibility. What they had not expected was how completely the ink would mask its alterations. Hermione wrote with her usual intensity, unaware that every sentence she formed morphed into something unrecognizable the moment it touched the parchment. The charm embedded in the ink waited for certain keywords and emotional spikes, twisting her academic reflections into strange romantic suggestions and bizarre observations. Where she believed she had written a formal evaluation of the Levicorpus spell, the ink transformed it into the Levicorpus charm is exceedingly romantic when cast under the moonlight, as it inspires a sense of gentle togetherness. Another section, intended to highlight Professor Flitwick's contributions to charm development, regenerated itself into a line stating that Flitwick is an adorable little short fellow with delightful ears that wiggle when he smiles. Hermione read none of this. The spell ensured invisibility of alterations to her own eyes until her quill left the parchment. By the time she submitted the essay, Hermione felt a rare sense of satisfaction, believing she had produced one of her strongest assignments of the term. Professor Flitwick, however, experienced a level of shock rarely seen in his classroom. As he read line after line, his eyebrows climbed higher, his cheeks reddened, and his usual cheerful composure faltered. He whispered to himself a phrase he once said during Harry, feed to second year. Students must practice discretion and clarity. The essay read like the ramblings of a student under a confundus charm, rather than the work of the most academically rigorous witch in her year. The situation demanded clarity, and the entire charms class learned of the embarrassment long before Hermione did. The following day, Hermione sat at her desk expecting praise for her scholarship. Instead, Flitwick gently placed the parchment before her, with visible concern, asking her to reread the assignment. The altered text shimmered into visibility, revealing sentences she could not believe she had written. The spell, now broken by a teacher's magic, exposed every humiliating phrase. Her eyes moved rapidly across the parchment, her expression tightening as understanding dawned. She recalled Fred and George passing around a suspiciously labelled bottle in the common room the night before. The realization struck her with the force of a rogue bludger. Hermione's reaction became the talk of Gryffindor Tower. She felt embarrassment curdle into outrage, not because the twins had tricked her, but because the prank had undermined the hard work she had poured into her academic responsibilities. The idea that Professor Flitwick thought she had intentionally submitted such nonsense filled her with indignation. The Gryffindor table at breakfast witnessed her fury radiating in silent waves, sending even the bravest first years scrambling away. The twins, who usually wore smirks of triumph after a successful prank, exchanged uneasy looks that morning,